Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's episode we are talking about Azor's Familiar, which is probably the best control deck in the current Pauper metagame. As you can see, the deck appears to be the third most played deck in Pauper and MTGO Pauper, at least regarding the MTG Goldfish data. And well, why I called Familiar a control deck? Because compared to the earlier version of Familiars back in 2014-2015, which was mostly a combo deck, right now Familiar is more relying on ephemerate and time walk effect to win against basically any opponent. Well, let's start taking a look at the earliest versions of Familiar. At that time, Familiar was played as an Esper control deck, relying on Cloud of Fairies as a way to get an infinite amount of mana. So basically, if you have a Ghostly Flicker and bounce Cloud of Fairies and Mnemonic Wall or Archaeomancer, you can get a bunch of mana. So basically, if you have two bounce land, you tap for mana, bounce Cloud of Fairies and Mnemonic Wall, and untap two bounce land, you generate 1 mana. So you don't really need Sunscape Familiar or Nightscape Familiar to get infinite mana, but if you have them, you are doing the same thing but faster. So at that time, at least for the tabletop Pauper, Capsize was the main win condition instead of Sage Road Denizen, but regarding Magical Line, Sage Road Denizen was still the combo finisher way to go, because Capsize is pretty slower compared to Sage Road Denizen, because with Sage Road Denizen you just need to blink Denizen and wall and mill your opponent instead of Capsize, because with Capsize you bounce all your opponent's permanent and then you win via combat step. So you need something like 5 or more turns. I don't really know. This is depending on how many copies of Cloud of Fairies and Mudra you have on the battlefield. Of course, I called the deck Esper Familiar because I was playing the black mana just to play Nightscape Familiar and Ripping Graves, and Deep Analysis, Ghost Bears Faithful, and obviously Ephemerate. They weren't a staple in the deck already. Composite Research was the main card advantage spell, the non-creature card advantage spell, because it costed only 3 mana, and 4C was often alongside Composite Research because it was for a 4 mana spell, but it allowed you to dig something like 6 cards on your top deck. It's nothing different compared to the current Familiar, the mana base I mean, because the only thing that truly differs is the lack of Mortuary Mire, which wasn't already printed at the time, but also they had 6 copies of the bounce lands, 3 copies of Azor's Chancery, and 3 copies of Dimmer Aqueduct. If I remember correctly, some lists were also playing the 7th copy of the 7th bounce land, probably Azor's Chancery. The deck was really great because potentially you were able to win at something like turn 5 or turn 4, which was pretty fast for the Pauper metagame at that time. after some time, if I remember correctly, at the end of 2015 or in the early 2016, Cloud Ferris got the ban X. So basically, Familiar was forced to play a more control-ish gameplay, cutting Netscape Familiar and cards like Capsize and Capsize mostly, to add more counter spells and eventually the Horror. But fundamentally, the UV Familiar or Esper Familiar, which started to be played as a control deck, was pretty similar to the current Familiar deck. So the current UV Familiar deck started to be seen something like in 2017 with Dimir Delver as tier 0 with Gash, Daze and Foil, because it had a favorable matchup against Dimir Delver thanks to cards like Godsphere's Faithful and Snap. So basically the deck just was a sort of control-ish familiar deck with the same exactly Time Walks effects. This one is the most recent familiars list, and current days familiars list has some characteristics cards in Deep Analysis, Ephemerate, Snap, and of course Ghost of Flicker. So basically the current familiars list is running a less amount of Snap effect, because Snap is good but not often, mostly because the current Pauper metagame is not filled with a lot of aggressive stacks. Is more relying on having a lot of creatures on the battlefield to block and get enough time to go online with Ephemerate, Arcomancer, and eventually Snap or Prohibit. So it's just trying to take some tempo advantage and then have a Ephemerate win con. Ghost of Flicker is right now a weaker version of Ephemerate, and most lists of Familiar are playing 3 copies of Ephemerate instead of the 2 copies. As you can see, they're not running anymore a coin chart, which was the for most time the 4th copy of Snap in the control-ish versions of Familiar. Right now they seem to be adding the Unbreaker Cleric instead of the coin chart, because the coin chart was mostly played as a way to resolve enchantment, and the Unbreaker Cleric can get 2 extra lives or destroy a Pestilence or a Makeshift Nation, which is great. They're also running the Modern Age, which I think is a bad way to get extra draws, because it doesn't generate card advantage, it's just a looting effect, but leaving a 2/3 flying champ blocker is great to get enough time against both Metalcraft and Ferris, because those two are the two of the most played decks in the challenges. Vector Glider seems to be probably good enough, because against those decks you usually need a lot of flying creature and you only have 4 copies of Blue Drifter. So anytime you were able, you just try to channel block a Glint Hook or a Ninja with Blue Drifter. Right now you just have 4 extra flying creatures, and that's great against those decks because you have more card advantage, so you can force them to have extra removable spells to deal with your Vector Glider, or if they don't have, you just left an extra flying creature on the battlefield to block those annoying flying creatures. There's nothing particular in the current metagame familiars besides the ENG presence of Dust to Dust in their sideboard. So I think it's important to note that after the ban of Sojourner's Companion, both Jeskai and Ephemerate and Familiars get a huge up in popularity thanks to the presence of 2 cards, and those 2 cards are both white. I'm talking about Ephemerate and of course Dust to Dust, because with something like 7 land denial effects in form of Dust to Dust and Rogue Existence, because the earlier versions of Familiars were playing exactly 7 of those cards in their sideboard, they were able to have a good matchup against Affinity at the post side, and Affinity usually is losing to Ephemerate Loop at least game 1, and game 2 you have an extra win condition in form of Dust to Dust, so you are able to also exile their creature, because they right now have only Gurmagangler and your Enforcer as a win cons, okay, alongside Makeshift Munitions. But Dust to Dust is something like more flexible, because you can use it as a time walk effect in the first 3 turns, and then in mid-late game you are able to exile Blood Fountain or Mirror Enforcer, and since it exiles, it makes Blood Fountain something pretty crappy and useless against Familiars. I think that right now Familiars is much better compared to Jeskai, because you don't fear Dust to Dust in a metagame filled with Dust to Dust and Modern Horizon 2 artifact lands, and you are also more stable regarding the mana base, and against aggressive decks usually you are relying more on cards like Stormhorn Dignitary to time walk your opponent instead of cards like Galvanic Blast or Bolt or Braid or From Slash. So basically Familiars seems to be better positioned against Affinity, and can also play a fair enough matchup against Fairies thanks to cards like Motemor H. Of course you are weaker to Fairies because you don't have Pyroblast or 1 mana removal spells to draw creatures, but you can still run Last Breath. And Last Breath is probably the best removal spell for this deck, because it can address both Elves and Wolves combo, which are the most troublesome matchups for Familiars, and you can also address Fairies, which can be pretty difficult if you don't have enough champ blockers to block them. So a Familiar in certain ways is the same deck as Flickertron and Jeskai Ephemerate, but is not relying on 1-for-1 removal spells, and is not relying on the Foglock most times at least, and is more relying on having more creatures to block your opponent and to get time advantage, to get enough time to build the Ephemerate lock. As you can also see, Godsphere's Faithful is probably the white most important card alongside Ephemerate, and I think that I also want to always play 3 copies of Ephemerate in this deck. I think that is also important to see how the Familiar deck started to be again played a lot of Magic Online, because as I already said, it started to be saying again with the Dimir Dauber metagame with Gash, but it wasn't really popular, and after the ban of Gash it wasn't really played a lot. But with Modern Horizon 1 they printed Arcum's Astrolabe, and Arcum's Astrolabe in combo with Mystic Sanctuary allowed Familiar to go again as a combo deck. So Godsphere's Faithful was already played because it was great to block the more aggressive deck and was great against Ferris, and at that time Ferris was mostly played as is it Ferris? But the deck was still a combo deck, which is pretty obvious since they aren't playing in this list any counter spells, and they are playing 3 copies of Nightscape Familiar alongside Sunscape Familiar. But I really want for you to notice that this mana base is pretty different compared to the bounce land filled mana base of the first version of Familiar, because Cloud of Ferris got the main X, Snap was less important, and Mystic Sanctuary was the main win con. As you can see, Mnemonic Wall is just a one-off in this list thanks to the presence of Mystic Sanctuary. So the win con was just having Mystic Sanctuary with Mystic Sanctuary on turn 4 or on turn 5, and then if you have 2 copies of your familiars, you can evoke Drifter for only 1 mana, and for only 1 mana cast Ghostly Flicker, blinking your Muldrifter and your Mystic Sanctuary. So basically you are casting Ghostly Flicker for 0 mana because Mystic Sanctuary retreat on the battlefield and tap it, and you put on top of your deck Ghostly Flicker. Then you draw 2 cards with Muldrifter, and basically you draw all your library. After drawing your library, you play Snap, bounce enough targets to generate enough mana, and then cast Iceberg Cankers and Mnemonic Wall. After doing that, you bounce Mnemonic Wall and Snowcurl Island. Iceberg Cankers triggers similar to Siege or Denizen whenever a snow permanent enters on the battlefield, so you mill your opponent. You can also win without having Mnemonic Wall on the battlefield, because if you haven't yet land dropped, you can play the second copy of Mystic Sanctuary, and after that you just need to have another copy of Ghostly Flicker. So basically you blink 1 Mystic Sanctuary and 1 Snowcover Island and put your Ghostly Flicker on the top. Then you play your second copy of Ghostly Flicker, targeting Mystic Sanctuary and Mnemonic Wall, and draw 2 cards. Oh yeah, there's not necessity for having the second Mystic Sanctuary in that scenario, but as I already said, if you have 2 copies of Mystic Sanctuary, you can also blink 2 Mystic Sanctuary to put on top 2 cards, for example the second copy of Ghostly Flicker, and then after doing that you just need to, for example, evoke an Elder Drifter, draw 2 copies of Ghostly Flicker, and well, the deck was just able to do everything with enough copies of Mystic Sanctuary and infinite mana basically. Deck was really great as a combo deck and was also really cool to play, but sadly they banned both Astrolabe and Mystic Sanctuary for obvious reasons, so after that Familiar fled to the control role. And well, you know, Ephemerate is just as great card that is just Ephemerate enough to have a performant Flicker control deck. The last list that I want you to show is the Grixis Familiar. Grixis Familiar started being playable after the print of Ardent Elementalist. This list is skewing white to add Nightscape Familiar, because Nightscape Familiar discount both blue spells and red spells, so that means that you are able to play Ardent Elementalist by just 1 red mana if you have 3 copies of Nightscape Familiar on the battlefield. But that's important because if you have, for example, 2 copies of Nightscape Familiar or 1 Nightscape Familiar and 2 bounce land, you can just cast Ardent Elementalist, bring him back Snap, cast Snap, untap your bounce land, generate at least one single mana, and by doing that you generate infinite mana. And that's important because alongside the already banned Galvanic Relay, the deck was as a true combo deck able to get an infinite amount of cards, and then after doing that you are able to play the second copy of Ardent Elementalist and then generate again infinite mana, blink an infinite amount of time, 2 copies of Ardent Elementalist, and bring back Foreign Dice or Compulsive Research and mill your opponent. So the deck was sweet and early similar to the Extron deck, but it required a crazy amount of time just to get infinite, so wasn't the really performance on Magical Line at least, and was also weaker compared to the Azeroth Familiars deck for the simple reason that not having Godsphere's Faithful, Stonehound Dignitary, and Ephemeris is a huge loss for a Blink deck. Also, this kind list was also playing Sitting Song and Metamorphose as a way to get extra mana alongside Nightscape Familiar, but when I tried this deck I found it more consistent as a sort of value deck with Old Drifter, so I think that deck was more consistent when you in game 2 or game 3 against for example Furries, you were cutting Galvanic Relay to add and Sitting Sun to add Moon Drifter and the order, so for that reason I think that probably Grixis would be would be eventually better as a control deck, and if you want to play a familiar control deck, probably it's better to play it as an Esper or as an Xurius or whatever. At least well, just play white in familiar because Ephemerate and the other white stuff is just too good to not play it. Okay, guys, we talked about the deck and all, I think. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you tomorrow, since I'm uploading your play of the Twitch streaming, which where I played Rustic Rock. I will not stream on Twitch on Tuesday because I will not able. I will record a video with another YouTuber that time, and probably I will stream on Monday instead of Tuesday. The Thursday streaming will be still at the same time and the same day. See ya.